Hi guys. Well, as Professor George says, I'm going to speak in English. I don't really speak Portuguese, even though this is a Portuguese Congress, language Congress. But sorry about that. But I'm going to talk about something about Macau. So that somehow relates to the Portuguese-speaking, with the theme of the Portuguese-speaking Congress. And I'm going to talk about medical law in Macau. And the reason why I chose this topic, if you guys are not really sure about what implementation diagnosis is, I'm going to explain it later. The reason why I chose about this topic is because medical law is one of the legal system or regulation that is I would say on the rise in Macau. In the past, medical law has been very fragmented. It has been very, well, people don't really apply it, and the government has not been doing its job very well in making legislations, regulating different activities. So, but things have been changed since 2017. So we are going to see a lot of different changes regarding to medical law, which I think is going to be very exciting. And this is the reason why I chose this topic, for you to share with you guys regarding to how medical law in Macau has been doing and what are the ways forward for Macau. But of course, due to time limits, I would try to narrow the scope down by asking just a few questions before for this topic. The question that I'm going to ask is basically well, if the government has not been doing very much in the past, how much are they going to do now? Especially, should the government intervene in family planning of private citizens? Okay, so if I want to give birth to a child, should the government intervene? If I'm not able to give birth, and should the government help me? Okay, those are the kind of questions that I'm asking. And second, if the answer to the question is yes, to what extent or to what degree should the government help? Okay, so what kind of means should the government actually apply to achieve the end of helping the citizens? So these are the two questions I'm going to ask for this conference. And for the first question, the law in Macau basically has, for a very long time, since '94, Article 10 of the law, number 6/94, basically says that, well, it is the job for the government to cooperate with private citizens in order to arrange family planning. And the family planning in Macau basically means the guidance on inheritance. Well, if you have any inherited diseases and what are you going to do about it? Birth control, handling of infertility, and prevention of diseases, inherited diseases, sexually communicated diseases as such. So these are the, well, we do have a legal source for governments cooperating with private citizens regarding to infertility. And infertility is basically something I am going to talk about in particular, because medical law is such a great field, it's such a big field, and family planning, infertility, what if I'm not able to bring up, to give birth to a natural or genetic related offspring? What am I going to do? Well, since technology has been advancing in a pretty progressive state, that question has actually been answered somehow by technology, which is what I call the assisted reproductive technologies, or ART. Basically, ART has a lot of different scenarios or categories inside. And according to the latest, the latest dispatch from the Macau's director from the Health Bureau, he basically stated that there are 3 types of ART in Macau: artificial insemination, in vitro fertilization, and the transfer of embryos, gametes, and zygotes. So these are the 3 types of ART that is, well, legally recognized in Macau. Okay, but of course, if you have been looking into the Portuguese legislation, for example, Law 32 of 2006, basically now is in its 6th edition. Basically, it talks a lot more regarding to what ART is than the Macau scenario. And of course, the Macau scenario will be changed soon. But somehow, this is the latest regulation that we have in 2017. These ARTs is not very comprehensive. So thinking about the scope of the technologies that we have already, The reason why we only allow these 3 types of ART being practiced in Macau is because due to several reasons. Well, the first reason is that religious. Macau is what I consider very conservative. I'm not from Macau, I just work in Macau, but I think Macau is very conservative. The Catholic influence is pretty strong in Macau, and the parish churches basically are very against the norm or the notion of ART. They think that by having human intervention into human reproduction is basically wrong. Okay, and second is lack of demand. If you have been to Macau or somehow knew where Macau is or how small Macau is, it only has around 700,000 people, more or less, on a place that is about 30 square kilometers around. That is a very small population on a very small piece of land. So the cases on ART, the demand on ART is not very high anyway. Okay, and the third reason why ARTs has not been recognized that much in Macau is because there's simply lack of specialists. Macau does not have a medical school, so most of the doctors trained have to be coming from abroad or somewhere else. For example, they go to students who are aspiring doctors, they go to Taiwan, Hong Kong, mainland China, or elsewhere to get their MBBS, which is their medical degree, before they come back and practice in Macau. And since we don't have a medical school and we don't have a specialized medical school to basically give license to different specializations, this is one of the reasons why ART has not been very widely practiced in Macau. And of course, the fourth reason is, of course, related to the law, because as I said earlier, the law is very fragmented. Okay, it's here and there, everywhere, talks about a bit about ART, but doesn't really talk that much. And people just wonder, what are the scope that is actually allowed by the law that we can actually practice, because some of the doctors actually know about the techniques of ART, but they are not sure whether if they are able to practice that in Macau. For example, recently China has basically opened up the limitation on the one-child policy. If you guys know about it, China in the past basically families are only allowed to have one child. So this has been lifted several years ago, and basically a lot of families, basically they come to Macau to ask for help. For example, they want to do IVF in order to conceive another son or daughter. And for the Chinese people, basically, there is often a thought that male is basically a preference over the female. So a lot of the families not only come to Macau to try to have another child, they also ask the doctors to say that I want a boy. Okay, so basically, I want to choose the sex, the gender of the child. Well, is this allowed? Is this not allowed? Well, the government does not really say it until, like, for example, 2017, saying that this is not allowed. And the government, as I said, 2017 is basically the year that the government of Macau started to recognize the importance of medical law and started to really thinking about having a unified, more uniform law that basically can regulate many different aspects of not just ART, but all the important topics that medical law basically could cover. Okay, so before I talk about the new draft law on the medically assisted reproductive technologies, basically these are the laws basically scattered around different categories that talks about ART on some aspects. We have the Macau Civil Code basically talking about ART. For example, if you are a child born due to IVF, who is going to be your parents, or who are going to be your parents, issues about inheritance, issues about parenthood, and the decree law number 111/99 basically talks about biotechnology and human dignity. So it somehow doesn't really talk about ART, but it talks about embryos, which is very important because we are going to talk about IVF. What are the status? What is the status of the embryo? What will become of them if once you create a lot of embryos? Can we do research on them as such? And then the dispatch number 12/SS 2017, that is the latest one that I have just talked about, the dispatch from the Director of the Health Service. So basically, these are the only three different categories of the law basically talking about ART. Okay, so it doesn't really talk, so we don't have, as you can see, we don't have a uniform law that basically dealing with ART, unlike the Portuguese experiences. But we have different laws scattered around and not really clarifying what those words or limitations mean, because a lot of them are basically principle-based. So we need the courts to actually explain it. We need the legislations to actually explain it, but they haven't, well, because we don't have much cases. So that is also something that makes people wonder, because the courts doesn't speak. Okay, so the government basically, well, since beginning from 2017, basically have drafted a law, what I call the draft law on medically assisted reproductive technologies, or just simply the draft law. Basically, they want to expand the scope of ART, and they wanted to produce a more unified regulation on the use of ART, because Macau has been lagging quite behind with the advancement of the ART technology. So as you can see that the scope has basically been expanded. Before, we only have like 3 different types of ART. Now we have 5, okay? And C and E are the ones that has been added to. And basically, the one that I will be discussing is basically the last one, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. And what is a PGD? Well, PGD basically I'll just talk about this first. PGD is basically a diagnosis, something, a genetic testing. Okay, so if one parent or both parents knew that they carry certain kind of genetic diseases, what they would do is that they will be afraid or worried about passing those diseases to their offspring. So what they could do is basically use IVF technology, basically combining the sperm and the egg outside the human body first. So once they become an embryo, in 3 days' time after the conception, the lab technicians basically took some cells away from the embryo, and they look and select the embryos that is basically disease-free. Okay, so once they have found the disease-free embryos, then they will implant that embryo back to the woman's uterus. Okay, so basically PGD is this technique that basically prevents the genetic diseases that will carry on for the family, the bloodline of the family, to choose an embryo that basically will stop the genetic disease from carry on. So basically PGD has been invented for that purpose, and PGD has been very, well, useful. But the question is, well, PGD has basically evolved to more purposes than just trying to prevent passing the genetic disorder to the offspring, which I will talk about later. If the government wants to include PGD into the ART, what is the scope anyway? Because we'll even talk about the scope. What is the extent? What does the law talk about? That's something that we want to make it clear. And going back a bit, ART basically is about trying to treat infertility. Okay, so as I said before, if I'm not able to conceive a child naturally, I will need the technology's help. And ART is basically treating of infertility and also treatment of serious health diseases. For example, PGD try to prevent the transmitting of the genetic diseases, but not just only the genetic diseases. A lot of the law, for example, the law in Portugal also says that aside from genetic diseases, if you have infectious diseases, for example, if a man or woman carries a sexually transmitted disease, you could also use ART to prevent that from passing down to the offspring. Okay, so basically that's the aim for ART. So treating infertility, if you're not able to born kids, you can use the technology. You can also use the technology to prevent diseases from passing down to your kids. So basically that's what ART does. And the issue, as I said, the scope for the draft law has not been very clear because we haven't really have the law passed in the legislation because there are so many debates, ethical debates, legal debates, and the contest from the church and many different voices that has been talking about. But some of the things that after I've been looking into the draft law that I would have to say that I'm very confused regarding to some of regarding to the scope. For example, is PGS included? I will explain what that is. PGD and PGS is actually something that is very similar. And are we looking for prevention of the disease, or are we talking about the treatment of the disease? That's something that I've talked about. ART basically talks about the both. But in the law, what are we talking about? And third one basically talks about sterile and infertile as the prerequisite for PGD. Basically, that question actually asks who will be eligible for assessing into the technology of PGD, who can use it. And fourth one, high or low penetrance. So basically, these are the four issues that I found after reading the draft law, and somehow I was wishing that by having this article out, that somehow will help the government to move into a way forward that actually makes the draft law a more solid and more comprehensive one. So I will basically deal with the questions one by one. PGS is basically something that is related to PGD. Well, that's the acronym for pre-implementation genetic screening. Okay, so as I said, diagnosed PGD basically is trying to prevent the genetic diseases from carrying down to the offspring. PGS is basically for women who are of a more advanced age. So if you are a woman, for example, 40s, 50s, and you might have a higher chance of miscarriage. Okay, so PGS is basically a technique that will basically check whether if the embryo, if being implanted back to your uterus, will you have a chance of actually being successful? Okay, so PGS is something that has not been really discussed, but a lot of if you look into the practical clinical experiences, many hospitals have actually used concurrent PGD and /PGS. So if you are eligible for having a PGD, basically hospitals normally will do a PGS on you as well because it doesn't really harm you, and basically the procedures are pretty much similar. But in Macau, it hasn't really been answered, so that's something that I was questioning as well. The second one, prevention or treatment. When we talk about treatment, we are talking about not on the embryo itself, because if we are talking about PGD, we are talking about two different technologies. We're talking about IVF, okay, and then we are talking about the diagnosis itself. But if we are talking about treatment, we're not treating the embryo itself. If we found the embryo does have genetic defects, we don't treat them. Okay, basically we store them away. We only find the ones that are healthy, and then we basically put it back into the woman's body. But PGD basically has a lot of advancements that basically will relate to treatment on someone else. For example, I'm not sure about if anyone of you have been heard of what we call as the savior siblings or savior babies. Basically, that is for example, if family A has a kid, okay, and the kid has severe genetic diseases, and probably he or she needs a bone marrow transplant, but it's very hard to get a donor that will basically will fit the kid, okay? Because if the bone marrow rejects, once you have if the donor's bone marrow rejects in the body of the kid, basically the kids will go worse, okay? So PGD has a technique, what we call the HOA, if you can see on the PowerPoint up there. Basically means that we will create another baby, okay, the sibling of the kid. And basically, the bone marrow, for example, usually the brothers or sisters' bone marrow usually will match to the kid who is sick, okay? So by doing this, basically, well, we are talking about treatments here. But, of course, this is something that is very controversial because we are talking about creating a life that is almost a tool for the other one. Okay, and under the theory of Kant, and this is something that is unwelcome because Kant says that everyone is the end, not the mean for someone else. So this is something that has been very controversial. In the U.S., severe babies basically aren't regulated. You can just do it. But for example, in places like UK, it has been severely regulated, and Portugal is somewhere in between. In Macau, we don't know yet, okay, because we are talking about the draft law. So this is something also the government has not really discussed. So something that troubles me as well, because if we have a technology that is actually helpful, and if you are a family who has a kid that has genetic diseases, or if you have a technology to help that kid, but because of law, you are prevented from doing so. Well, of course, you can go outside, for example, you go to the United States and get the treatment. But if you want to do it in Macau, it might either be non-capable or it might just be illegal. So what would the government say? And one of the issues is that because in Macau, when we talk about the use of LRT, the draft law basically limits to couples who are basically married, who are above 18 years of age, who are not declared incapacitated by the courts, and basically they have to have infertility issues. So the question is, since we can use PGD to prevent passing the disease to the offsprings, what if me and my wife, for example, we don't have any issues with infertility, but we know that because either me or her has a genetic disease, and we don't want it to pass down to our kids. Under the current draft law, I'm not able to do that. I cannot use PGD to prevent the disease from passing down to my offspring. Do you think this is fair? Well, of course, people have different opinions, but there's a European case. If you guys are aware of the Costa and Pavin against Italy, this is a European Court of Human Rights case basically talking about exactly the same issue. They are basically healthy couples, but they wanted to use PGD to, what I mean by healthy is that they don't have problem of reproduction, but they have inherent genetic diseases which has been passed down to their first kid. So on their second kid, basically they wanted to use PGD to prevent that from happening. But they are Italian couples, and the Italian government basically say no. Okay, so and that's the reason why they go to the European Court of Human Rights and say that, well, it is against the European Charter on Human Rights, Article 8 and Article 14, which they have prevailed. So the European Court of Human Rights basically supports the notion that, well, you cannot use infertility as a prerequisite for using PGD. Okay, so basically that somehow answers my question a bit. But what will happen in Macau, I'm not sure too. Okay, but this is something that the government can always look into by comparing to other approaches as such. And PGD also has a very interesting application is that you can actually check whether if your kid basically will carry your disease. And currently, a lot of the countries or regions that allows the application of PGD basically only allows if the disease is what we call the high penetrance. Basically means that it is very severe. The disease is going to happen when the kids are very small. So at the infant stage, the disease will basically already occur. Okay, but what if there is a disease that is genetically that will pass down to my kids, but like for example BRCA, I'm not sure if you guys know about this. This is a gene for the human breast cancer. If this is something that could be transferred down to your kids, but as a child, you don't suffer from this. When you are a young woman, you probably don't suffer anything from this as well. You only might start to develop cancer or any sorts when you are in your middle age. Is this allowed? Okay, so we limit the practice of PGD to stop the passing down of the diseases to those that is very severe, very fast, or to as long as there's an inherent disease, I will just have the right to stop it, even if the disease might not go on, might not actually occur maybe until 40 or 50 years later. Or sometimes it might not ever occur as well. I might have carried the cancer gene, but I never will get a breast cancer. So those are some of the things that, well, is very controversial. That's something that the government needs to have a debate on, which I don't really think the Macau government has been doing a very good job on debating in these regards. I welcome Macau government's initiation for having on looking into a more unified law on ART, but the way that they are approaching to this makes me worried to some certain point, because I was talking about in the past it was very scattered, and I don't want to look into something that is more uniform but undefined. That is, well, anyway, down the road, those are not good alternatives. And anyway, I'm not going to bore you too much with my presentation, so I'm going to stop at this slide. Basically, what I think about what Macau government could do is basically to make it more refined when they are doing their legislation. What ARTs basically could be divided into medically helpful and those that are non-medically helpful. One of the things that people are worried about applying ARTs because it often relates to eugenics. Okay, the Nazis have been doing this. Eugenics has been doing it in the 30s in the US, in Japan. So when people talk about using technologies to make human better or more healthier, it often carries this thought that you're playing God. You're doing eugenics which should not be done in the first place. But I would have to say that, well, there might be eugenics involved, but there is what we call the positive and the negative eugenics. The negative eugenics basically is what PhD was meant for. You try to stop diseases being carried down to your offspring. Positive eugenics might be saying that, oh, I want my child to look prettier, to have different color of hair, to look taller, to grow taller. Those are different scenarios. So these are some of the things that the government of Macau, when they are drafting for the new law, these are some of the, well, I have pointed out 4 areas which they really have to think about how to answer. And of course, they have to be more refined in thinking about if they want to draft ART for medical law. These are some of the things that has been discussed in Europe, in Portugal, and around the world. These are some of the things that they should look into. Eugenics are not necessarily bad, but it just depends on what kind of eugenics you are looking into. Okay, so basically those are some of my initial findings and something I want to share to you about regarding to the scenario of the new medical law that has been drafting in Macau. Well, I hope that it interests you, and I hope that sparks some debates and thoughts regarding to the use of ART. Okay, because it's very controversial legally, ethically, really on religious backgrounds, anything. Okay, so thank you very much, and I will leave the floor to the next speaker.